Welcome to the sixth and final session of the Story of God, Part 2, where we've been talking about the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. And I've got to admit that it's been quite a challenge to try to figure out what to include in a six-session series, because there's a lot of content. But I knew that I could not complete the series without talking about the resurrection of Christ. Sometimes Christians will place almost all the emphasis on human salvation on the cross and Jesus' death. I personally subscribe to a theory of the atonement called Christus Victor, which places more emphasis on Jesus' resurrection. My understanding goes something like this: that the cross is the world's answer to the world's problems, and the resurrection is God's answer to the world's problems. Jesus came to love and to bring liberation to the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized, and this threatened powerful and wealthy people. And so their answer to the problem was to execute Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah, the King of the Jews. God's answer to the world's problems is to raise Jesus back to life. And in this event, death is destroyed and new creation breaks forth into the world that God has formed and created. It's through the resurrection that we have life and salvation and hope. This is the centerpiece of the entire New Testament. Whether we're looking at the Gospels or the book of Acts, the general letters, what we call the Catholic epistles, Paul's letters, or the book of Revelation, all of these writings are founded upon the belief that on the third day, Christ was raised back to life, and that this has made all things new. When we look at these writings, we discover that their focus is usually on what this event means. So for instance, when we look at the writings of Paul, who claims to have encountered the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus, and you can see that depicted in the picture on this slide, he talks about the death and the resurrection of Jesus not so much as something that happened back then, but as something that you and I participate in. And Christians have since called his teaching the teaching of cruciform, that you and I die with Christ and that we are raised back to life as a new creation. Paul says things like, "I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, though not I, it is Christ who lives within me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith through the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." In Philippians chapter 3, Paul says, "I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable even unto his death." And in Romans chapter 6, Paul asks this rhetorical question of, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that God's grace may increase?" And then Paul answers his own question, "May it never be. Do you not know that those of us who have died with Christ have also been raised with him into new life?" And so for Paul, the story of Jesus' death and resurrection is absolutely a historical event that took place around 30 AD. But it's also something that continues to happen. And it's that event that continues to transform our lives and transform God's good creation to make all things new. Last week we talked about miracles in general and how that the New Testament simply takes for granted the fact that Jesus was a healer and that he certainly did supernatural deeds. He healed people who were sick. He raised the dead back to life. But we also talked about how that these miracle stories also have a deeper meaning. Just as Paul's letters focus upon Jesus' death and what it means, we find the same thing happening in all four Gospels but it's put in narrative form. And so in our time together today, what I want to do is look at all four Gospels and how they depict the resurrection of Christ and how these portraits give us several layers of theology to evoke our imagination and consider what this event of the resurrection means. We begin with the Gospel of Mark because it's believed that it is the first Gospel that was written and was used as a primary source for Matthew and Luke. If you open up your Bible to the last chapter in the Gospel of Mark, you should find a footnote at the bottom of the page, unless you're reading from the King James Version or the New King James Version, because these translations are based upon a totally different textual family. But if you're reading from any other English translation, you should find a footnote at the bottom of your Bible that says, Mark chapter 16 verses 9 and following are not found in the earliest manuscripts available for the Gospel of Mark. Instead, these verses were added much later, as much as a century or two after Mark's original composition. We're really blessed that we have over 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, which allows us to develop a science called textual criticism. You might have, let's say you've got 60 pages, 60 manuscripts of Mark's ending, and we're able to tell based upon the material that it was written on and the letters in terms of whether they were lowercase or uppercase in Greek, how old they are and where they may have come from. And so we can there's a science there. And one of the things that scholars have determined is that shorter and more difficult readings are more reliable than longer and clearer readings, because scribes who copied the biblical text by hand had a tendency to expand on difficult texts to try to clear them up. And when they did that, they got clearer and they got longer. And it seems that Mark's gospel is just a textbook example of this. The verses 9 and following were never a part of Mark's original gospel, which is kind of good news for us, because it's really the only text in the entire New Testament that suggests that Christians should handle snakes. So it's kind of an amalgamation of different resurrection accounts that we find in Matthew, Luke, and John, written much, much later. And it seems that the reason that scribes did this was they were troubled by the ending that they found. If you read Mark 16, 1 through 8, you'll find the story of the women going to the tomb on Easter morning. They're going to anoint Jesus' body. And they are greeted by a young man who's dressed in white. And he asks them why they're looking for the living among the dead. And he announces that Jesus has been raised back to life. There's actually no resurrection appearance of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, Jesus' last spoken words in the Gospel of Mark come from the cross, where he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so this young man tells them that they need to go and tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, just as he said. And the women, as the narrator tells us, the women run from the tomb with fear and trembling, saying nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's how Mark's gospel ends, which kind of makes sense why some scribes may have felt the burden to include what they knew from the other gospel stories, to include a resurrection appearance of Christ, to try to smooth out something that could be perceived as troubling. There's no resurrection appearance of Christ, and the story, the greatest story of redemption, ends with women running from the tomb in fear and trembling, saying nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. There are some biblical scholars who think that Mark's original ending looked a little bit like Matthew's original ending. And that somehow, as it was written on a scroll, that it somehow got worn off and we lost the original ending. There are some biblical scholars who think that Mark was writing around 69 or 70 A.D., right around the time that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. There was a lot of political conflict that was going on, a war broke out, and so there's one theory that maybe Mark was forced by his circumstances to end abruptly. I personally don't find either of these explanations very convincing. The majority of biblical scholars believe that Mark's original ending was abrupt, that it ended at verse 8 with the women running from the tomb in fear and trembling. And we might ask the question, well, why would Mark end it that way? How are you supposed to preach this message on Easter morning? Well, it makes more sense if you read Mark's gospel as a whole, because we find out that the disciples are kind of slow learners. They don't pick up on who Jesus is or what it means for him to be the Messiah. They struggle trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. In fact, Jesus has told them on 3 separate occasions that he's going to be executed and that he would be raised back to life on Easter morning, 3 days later. But none of them show up at the tomb. None of them are anticipating this event. And so it's really important for us to understand when we're reading through Mark's narrative the way that the disciples respond to Jesus and the supernatural things that he does. We find on multiple occasions that Jesus does something where he heals the sick, where he calms a storm, he brings someone back to life, and they look at each other like, who is this person? And they just don't quite get it. And sometimes it says that they were afraid. Now, this word afraid or fear is kind of tricky because it's not the kind of fear that you and I experience whenever we're alone in a room with a tiger or we find out that there's a ghost in the other room. It's not that kind of fear. It's a reverential kind of fear of awe and wonder, like, whose presence are we in? And Mark, throughout his gospel, develops this repertoire of words that indicate that the disciples are in awe and wonder of who Jesus is. And in Mark chapter 16, he throws out all the bells and whistles. The women, they are in fear and trembling. They are arrested with fear. The depiction of the women. And this makes sense, doesn't it? Because if we put ourselves in their shoes and we think about what it must have been like to show up at their friend's tomb and to find out that it's empty, we would be afraid too. To be greeted by someone who says that he's not dead, he's been raised back to life. We have to read all of Mark's story for it to make sense. And one of the most important components of Mark's gospel is response. And it kind of constantly is forcing us as the audience to answer the question, who do you say that Christ is? And some biblical scholars, I think, have rightly put it that the reason that Mark's gospel ends as a cliffhanger is that each and every one of us have to answer for ourselves. Do we believe in the resurrected Christ? How do we believe that the story ends? It's a powerful, powerful message. Unfortunately, what often happens is because Mark's gospel ends so abruptly that we fall into the same trap as the scribes several hundreds of years ago. We try to compensate and impose the resurrection narratives from Matthew, Luke, and John onto Mark's story. But Mark ends his story this way intentionally because there's a message, there's a meaning behind it all. Of course, Mark believes that Christ is risen. He says that in Mark 1:1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There's no question about that. but we need to step into the world of Mark's rhetorical structure, the beauty of his composition, to really appreciate the message of resurrection. Matthew's gospel has a similar ending to the gospel of Mark. It's almost like he picks up where Mark left off. And it's really ultimately about the disciples getting back to Galilee. They're all currently in Jerusalem. Jesus has told his disciples to meet with him back in Galilee, where all of their ministry had taken place. And so we find the 11 back in Galilee with Jesus. And this kind of reminds us that Judas has defected at this point, that he's out of the picture. And Matthew tells us that some of the disciples worshiped him and some doubted, which is quite interesting, isn't it? And then Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all the things that I have commanded you. And I am with you always, even to the ends of the earth." And Christians for a long time have called this the Great Commission. And there's really a lot here to unpack. I think the first thing that really stands out to me is the fact that Jesus doesn't just look at the disciples who worship him. He doesn't just send them out as witnesses, making disciples. He sends out all of them, even the ones who doubted. And that's pretty powerful, isn't it? That we're all different. Some of us have a different measure of faith. All of us have a different measure of faith, really. And yet, Jesus invites all of us, regardless of whether we're struggling with doubt or whether we are the ones who bow down and worship him. He invites all of us to go spread the good news of the resurrection of Christ. For me, that's a powerful, powerful message, that God isn't waiting for us to get all of our stuff together or to be perfect, but he invites all of us to go. We need to kind of unpack some of the grammar here, because sometimes we get the impression that when Jesus says, "Therefore go make disciples of all nations," I get this impression of like a cannonball that's being shot from one continent to another, and disciples who are frantically going around telling people about Jesus, asking if they found Jesus, and this sort of thing. But when we actually look at the grammar of this text, we find that the main verb in the sentence is make disciples. The main verb isn't go. In fact, this verb go is a participle. It's a present active participle, which means that it should actually be translated, "Therefore, as you are going, make disciples." And so Jesus isn't necessarily telling the 11 remaining disciples to travel into all the world and to make converts. Instead, he's talking about their way of life. As you are going about your way of life, make disciples of all ethne. And this could be translated Gentiles or nations. And this is really important because I think it alludes back to the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. We find that this is really where the biblical narrative begins, when God calls Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans and tells him that he's going to bless him with a plot of earth in the land of Canaan, a land that's flowing with milk and honey. And God tells Abraham that he's going to make this great nation out of him, so that Abraham and his descendants will bless all the nations of the earth. I think that Matthew, who is very much a Jewish theologian, is trying to convey the fact that God's promise to Abraham is finally being fulfilled. that through Jesus and his disciples and the church, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. Now, this is pretty cool because with Jesus and his disciples, there are 11 there with him, but counting Jesus, there are 12. And there are 12 tribes in the nation of Israel. And so this picture might be somewhat symbolic that the nation of Israel has been restored in Jesus. And that finally, the people that God has formed as the nation of Israel will go out and bless all the nations of the earth. Jesus says, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And so the story of resurrection is that Christ is present with us, and that with him we are able to go into all the world and bless all the nations, bless all the Gentiles, bless all people in the world, and invite them to become disciples and followers of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke is similar to Matthew and Mark in that it portrays the women going to the tomb early in the morning, finding that it's empty, going back and telling the men. And according to the Gospel of Luke, the men do not believe. Peter runs to the tomb to look for himself, and he discovers that it's empty, but he kind of walks away scratching his head. He's confused. He doesn't understand what has happened. And then Luke says, on that same day, there were two disciples who were traveling on the road to Emmaus, which was a 7-mile journey from Jerusalem. And these two guys, they were just absolutely bummed because they had heard about this figure named Jesus of Nazareth, and they had hoped that he might be God's Messiah. But during the Passover, they learned that he had been executed by the Romans, which absolutely dashed their hopes and dreams. Because there were a lot of messianic pretenders from that same time period, and their movements always ended when they were executed by the Romans. And as these two disciples are traveling back to their home, another mysterious figure appears on the road, and he listens to their story. He joins them where they are, and unbeknownst to them, it is the resurrected Christ. He joins them in this conversation, and he listens to them, and they don't know who this is. And it just, for me, it reminds us that that Christ joins us in our pain and in our suffering. And he's there with us even when we don't realize it. Even when we don't know it, the resurrected Christ, he is journeying with us in the hardest walk we will ever have to take. And when these two disciples make it to their home, they invite Jesus to come inside. And as they were journeying this whole time, Jesus has been trying to explain to them from the Hebrew scriptures why these events had to take place. And now they're seated at the table, and it says that Jesus broke bread and he blessed it, which is what we call Eucharistic language. It's descriptive of what we do when we celebrate Holy Communion. Just as Jesus had instituted with his disciples when he broke bread during the Passover and said, "This is my body." He took the cup and said, "This is my blood." And Luke tells us that when Jesus blessed the bread and broke it, that their eyes were open and they recognized him for who he was, and that Jesus disappeared from their midst. And historically, Christians have understood this story as teaching us about the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the Greek word for grace or thanksgiving, actually. And it teaches us that Christ is with us when we come to the table. When we bring all of our hurts and all of our sorrows and all of our disappointments, the resurrected Christ is there. And it's at the table when we receive the bread and the cup that our eyes are open and we experience the resurrected Christ. And this is Luke's unique contribution to the story of what Jesus' resurrection means. The final narrative is in the Gospel of John, and we really need an entire session for this because it is 2 complete chapters with multiple appearances of the resurrected Christ, and it is deep and it is rich and it is beautiful. But like the other Gospels, it begins in the garden on Easter morning with women going to the tomb. And we're told that Mary thinks that Jesus is the gardener. She sees this figure and she thinks that it must be the gardener, which I think is a little bit of a strange detail to include in the story. I mean, what was Jesus doing that made Mary believe that? It gets the wheels turning in my mind, and I think of Jesus on his knees, pulling weeds, planting seeds. Now, obviously, Jesus wasn't doing that, but what kind of imagery is John trying to evoke in our minds? I personally think that John is telling us the story of new creation. And he's alluding to the Garden of Eden at the beginning of the Hebrew creation narrative, where God made everything and it was good and it was perfect. And now there's been all the suffering and hurt and brokenness in the world, but God has destroyed death and sin, and new creation is here. That Jesus' resurrection brings new creation into the world. So I think that this is one of the theological layers that we find in the Gospel of John. We also find that Jesus appears to his disciples later that day, with the exception of Thomas. He wasn't there. The disciples were in hiding because they were afraid that they would get in trouble for being the followers of Jesus. But Thomas was absent. And it always makes me wonder, well, what was Thomas doing? Did he run out to the store to get milk and bread? Who knows what happened? But Thomas wasn't there, and all the disciples got to see Jesus, the resurrected Christ, and they were just absolutely amazed. And Jesus disappears. And then Thomas comes back in, maybe with the milk and the bread. And the disciples are so excited. They tell Thomas what has happened. And we kind of get it wrong when we call Thomas a doubter. Because in Greek, it simply says that he doesn't believe. There's a complete lack of belief. He doesn't believe their testimony. He doesn't believe what they have said. And so we can imagine, being in quarantine, what it must have been like for the disciples to be behind locked doors, to be in hiding for an extended period of time. And in my mind, I think of Thomas sitting at one end of the table by himself as this skeptic, as this critic, as his heart is hardened, and he's angry. Why, if Jesus is alive, why did he come back at a time when Thomas was gone? Is there something fundamentally broken, wrong with Thomas? And you can imagine all the questions that would come to his mind, and we can think of him as feeling excluded. And I imagine all the other disciples at the other end of the table, and they're just soaking it all in and talking about it over and over again. And of course, this is all just in my imagination, but I can just see Thomas getting so frustrated and angry, hearing them talk about something that sounds so ridiculous. And then 1 week later, Jesus appears again, specifically to Thomas, and we find it depicted in the picture on this slide, where Jesus invites him to touch the hole that's in his side and the holes that are in his feet. And there's some biblical scholars who who think that possibly the Gospel of John, one of the reasons that it was written was to counter an ancient heresy called Gnosticism, which did not believe that Jesus was a physical being, but he was just a spiritual being. And so maybe this story was included to let them know that even the resurrected Christ could be touched because he was a physical entity. He was a physical human being. We see this picture. We hear Thomas's words, "My Lord and my God," and he believes. And then there's this final third resurrection appearance in the Gospel of John. Jesus appears to his disciples, and they are in a boat fishing, which might indicate that they have gone back to their original vocation, that they've given up hope, that they have lost their direction, lost their way, and they're going back to the place, their station in life before Jesus called them. And Jesus appears to the disciples, and they get excited. They see him, and we're told that Simon jumps off the ship and swims to Jesus, and they eat breakfast on the shore. And after they eat this meal, Jesus has this kind of one-on-one conversation with Simon, who is probably still dealing with the fact that he had denied Jesus 3 times, just the shame and the guilt. And there's this conversation where Jesus completely and totally restores Simon and gives him this great sense of responsibility to care for God's people, to be the shepherd of the flock. And so there's really a lot of content in the Gospel of John when it pertains to the resurrection of Jesus. As we wrap it up, it's important to consider the implications. What do these stories teach us about the resurrection of Christ? Well, Mark's Gospel reminds us that we all have to answer this question. The question that we find all throughout the Gospel of Mark: who is this? When Jesus calms the storm, the disciples ask the question, who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him? And this is the question that's asked over and over again. And finally, when Jesus brings his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, he says, "Who do people say that I am?" And they offer some responses, but then Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" And the fact that Mark ends with this cliffhanger places the responsibility in each of our hands to answer for ourselves. Who do you say this man is? Do you say that he is the resurrected Christ, the Son of the living God? When we come to the Gospel of Matthew, it's deeply rooted in the story of the Hebrew Bible. The story of resurrection is about the fact that God's plan to bless all the nations of the earth is coming to fulfillment, and that as disciples of Jesus Christ, through the power of his resurrection, we can be witnesses of what God is doing. That we don't have to have all of our stuff together, that we can still be bruised and broken masterpieces, a work in progress, that this transformative event called the resurrection is shaping our lives to make us more and more like Jesus Christ every day. The Gospel of Luke reminds us that every time we come to this table to celebrate the Eucharist, to take the bread and the cup, that we are joining in this sacred, historic meal and trusting that the living, resurrected Christ is in our very midst, that he journeys with us through the deepest, darkest valleys, and that death cannot hold him down. Christ is with us. In the Gospel of John, it teaches us a lot of things. It teaches us that through Jesus' death and resurrection, sin and death have been destroyed and new creation is on the horizon. That God is restoring all things, and bringing them back to their original intent. And the story of Jesus' resurrection and the conversations that he has with Thomas and with Peter remind us that God is patient and that we don't always understand or really comprehend the power of God or the mysteries of the faith, but that Christ is patient with us, that God is patient with us. And the story with Simon Peter, it reminds us that there is forgiveness. Even when we deny Jesus, even when we abandon him, there is hope and forgiveness and restoration. In fact, Jesus will call us to care for the flock. The New Testament, absolutely at its very core, believes that the resurrection of Christ is a historical event that took place in space and time. But these stories that we find that are unique to each of the Gospels that I've mentioned, they're to help us unpack the meaning of this event and how it's intended to transform our lives. And I hope as you reflect upon this session and this time together that you will take a few moments to be quiet, to think of Paul's words that I want to know him and the power of his resurrection. And may that be your prayer and my prayer. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. Thanks be to God. Amen.